Hi there, and welcome to another BigLipz podcast. We are now on our fifth episode of our second series, and it is my turn yet again to host. My name is Sam Macaulay Blair. If this is your first time joining, and I am joined as ever by the wonderful Catherine Maurice. We are two former and current film students who are now moving into the realm of television, at least in terms of discussions. So we did have our entire first series where we talked at length over and over again about movies. Jaws was mentioned a fair few times.
Yeah.
And
Alien was another favourite.
yeah, exactly. And now to shake things up, we've transitioned to the role of television. So the format we kind of run with is every month we take turns hosting, and we will switch between content and concept for the podcast, basically. So last week, or last 2 weeks ago, Catherine hosted and gave us a lovely conceptual episode where we discussed adult animation, and now we're moving on to content, which actually quite nicely aligns with what we discussed. So this week we're here to discuss the popular Netflix TV series Arcane. And I swear that Netflix do not have like a sponsorship of this podcast. It's just kind of a coincidence that both shows I have picked have been Netflix produced shows, and I think the one that you picked, Catherine, we both watched on Netflix.
Yep. Yeah, that's very true.
But such is the digital era, I guess. Yeah, long live streamers. Just to begin with, Catherine, I am very curious. What are your overall thoughts on Arcane?
So I wanted to ask you, we've known each other for a while now, what do you think my thoughts were?
um, Great, put me on the spot right at the beginning.
I know, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I would optimistically, I'm going to say positive, but not overwhelmingly so.
Okay, fair. Because the reason I ask is because I surprised myself in how much I enjoyed it.
Oh, really?
And while I was watching it, I was thinking to myself, I was like, oh, this definitely isn't something that I would normally have watched. I didn't really have any, before you had mentioned it, I didn't have any kind of knowledge of it or anything like that. And I will admit, the first episode I wasn't massively keen on. It was it kind of validated exactly what I was thinking of the show, where I was like, oh god, this is very what it is. And then it wasn't until episode 3 I think it was the very end of episode 2 going into episode 3 where I was like, oh, this is good, I'm enjoying this. I think it was one of those nice shows where I kind of found myself kind of thinking about it and wanting to watch it even when I wasn't watching it, which is always nice. So yeah, overall I kind of like, I enjoyed it a lot more than I thought I did, and I had started watching it with my fiance because I thought that he would like it, but we both kind of had the same thoughts after the first episode, like, oh god, and he stopped watching it. And then, as I say, when we got to the third episode, I was like, you should start watching this again because I think you'd really like it. So yeah, my advice if anyone was going to watch it is stick in there till the third episode. And that's when it starts getting really good.
Yeah,
Carry on.
Yeah, no, I'd very much agree actually. I think like to begin with, I wasn't completely convinced. I think it definitely did take some time for me to kind of warm up to it, and I liked it from the get go, but I didn't love it from the get go. And I think it is very much. I was surprised how much of a sort of like character study and how much of a sort of slow burn it is. And I think it does some really interesting things in the way it sort of like builds out its story, and sort of develops like the narrative, along with like sort of fleshing out everything that it's introducing to you. But yeah, I would agree. Episode 3 and 4, I think, is where it really sort of picks up, and actually becomes like, I think it becomes a bit more distinct then as well. Like it has like its own sort of like unique style, and there is like a sort of specialness to it from the beginning. But at the same time, it does feel like it a lot of the setup is kind of like leaning into like cliche territory and sort of tropes. It didn't feel like something. It didn't feel like that much of a breath of fresh air, but the further along it got, the more I was like, actually, it does feel like I'm watching something quite unique here.
Yeah. I think especially the first few episodes, it was very like, I'm not massive on that whole kind of like steampunk type thing.
Yep.
And I was getting really nervous when I first watched it that it was going to be like you were going to be bombarded with that, and that was what it was going to be kind of about, was more the look of it than anything else. I think as well because obviously we'll discuss later on, but I hadn't played the game, so I didn't have any, and like I said, I hadn't heard about it. I didn't have any knowledge of it beforehand, so there was elements of it that they were talking about straight away that I was like, I've got no idea what that is. And it was a bit kind of like it put you almost on the back foot, like you didn't know what was going on, so do you really care? I think there was definitely elements that I didn't particularly enjoy. I think there was a few characters that I didn't really care about. I didn't really care about them. I didn't really care about their background or their kind of backstory. I did like the way that it jumped. We spent a lot of time with a lot of different characters, kind of like you're saying, where it kind of fleshed out a lot of the different characters, so no one felt, no one particularly felt cliched or anything like that. But yeah, I think one of the things it did really well was that it just wasn't afraid at all to just kill people off. Like pretty main characters, pretty integral characters, were killed off fairly quickly. And when that happened, the obvious example of that is Vi's friends Milo and Clara, I think the guy's name was.
Yeah.
They died pretty unexpectedly, and it was shocking at the time. And as I was watching it, I was kind of waiting for them to come back to life, and they never ever did. But I think that worked in its favour because it was very much like, in that way, no one is safe.
Yeah, absolutely. There was definitely like a bloodlust to the
Yeah.
rest of the show.
I think definitely it was very. It was very like. I think it was really, really well done with working with the kind of source material. It took like the kind of best parts of a game and playing a game and expanded on it. So it wasn't just like you were watching an adaptation of a game. It felt like it felt like its own thing, but it definitely felt, you could tell that it was based on a game.
Yeah, well, out of curiosity, so this was kind of our second discussion point. What was your familiarity with like the source material of the game that it's based on?
Literally little to no knowledge at all of the game. I had heard of it. I'd heard of League of Legends, but I hadn't ever played it. I didn't really know anyone that did play it. And the funny thing was, I had asked my best friend. I had asked her if she played it because she plays a bit more games than I do, and the only thing she said was like no, because it's very toxic. That was all she said about it. And then she told me to Google it, so that was about as much familiarity as I had with it. What about you? Did you play it?
So no, I had a flatmate once who was obsessed with it, and that is like literally my only like experience of like the game. I've like walked in his room and had conversations with him as he's playing it, and so I know like what type of game it is, but like even then, like I couldn't have like. I couldn't have told you the name of any character. I couldn't have told you a description of any character. I couldn't have told you anything about the world. In fact, I'm pretty sure every single time I saw him play it, the map that he was playing on was like this sort of green, almost like forest-esque area, which didn't really seem like applicable to the show at all.
No.
So I'm very kind of like, I know next to nothing about it. I know next to nothing about the lore. But I thought it was interesting how much the series just felt like its own thing, and obviously you can tell that it is like there's a really sort of rich lore that it's drawing from, because like it is like a really like well thought out world, with like characters that all sort of have their place, and there's like, you know, get everything from like politics to sort of like, even like you can sort of tell from like character designs and stuff, they do kind of look like video game characters at points, but not in a bad way. Like it didn't feel forced. It genuinely just felt like, it genuinely felt like it almost was it did exist to be a TV series rather than it felt like it was adapting a game and trying to like
Yeah.
cram in elements of the game. Have you ever seen like gameplay or anything of the video game?
I haven't. No, I had kind of, because it's similar to you. Like I wouldn't even have been able to recognize a picture of the character, any of the game characters or anything like that. So as I was watching it, I was kind of like googling it.
Yeah.
But I haven't like sat and watched any gameplay or anything.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because like from what I remember of the gameplay, it's a lot of just like you're sort of like top down view, and you're sort of like clicking to control characters, and yeah, it seems kind of almost like methodical, this sort of game. Whereas like if I had to guess, like if I knew nothing, if I knew literally nothing about the game, like I'd never heard of it, and I watched the TV series, and you asked me to like try and like imagine what the game it was based on was like, I don't think I would have ever been able to like guess that that's what it's based on, because it does feel sort of video gamey in some ways, but it feels more like it's based on like an action game or even like a shooter at points rather than like
Yeah.
that kind of video game.
Yeah,
which
I would imagine, if I was to imagine it as a game, having watched the TV show first, I would imagine a kind of like Assassin's Creed type
yeah
game
that's
where you pick your one character and you kind of go about your business.
yeah that's a very good point actually. Yeah, that's probably what I would end up guessing as well, because it does have that sort of feel. And it's interesting they managed to like adapt it but make it feel like a different type of game.
Yeah.
Which I guess I wonder if there's people that have like, because I think as far as I'm aware it's quite a popular show. I'm curious if there are people that will have played it and then will have watched it rather, and then attempted to play League of Legends and been bitterly disappointed.
Yeah. I
Uh,
wonder if it works the other way around. Like, if people who have played the game and then watched the show, there must be like bits in there that we haven't picked up on that are little nods to the game and stuff like that. So that would have been interesting had you played the game, I imagine.
Yeah, that's true actually. And I do feel like, because there was points in it where I was like, I mean, I've got no real basis for thinking this, but there was points in it where I was like, this feels like it's supposed to, it works, in terms of like, its own sort of narrative like fulfillment, but it does feel like at points that there are moments where you're like, this feels like it's maybe like paying homage to or like respecting the sort of like game or like maybe the designs. Like for instance, when was it Vi has like the gloves on, I feel like that's
Yeah.
probably like her character's sort of signature like look. Again, could be wrong, but it feels like that is like how her character is like probably known to people who play the game, and so that's
Yeah,
probably
because one of the things that I had googled was Jinx, and if you Google the character, it comes up with that kind of shark gun thing
Oh,
that she
really?
had at the very end. So that was like, I had googled that. I had seen that picture before I watched the last episode, and then even just from that, watching the last episode, I was like, oh, there's that gun. There's that shark gun.
That's quite cool actually. Yeah, I had no idea. That was one thing I was going to say as well was so obviously like I don't know if you had this experience, but like for instance, were you surprised at the sort of trajectory of the story? Obviously we mentioned like episode 3 and sort of 4. There's a time jump obviously between 3 and 4. Were you surprised when that happened, or?
I think it kind of made sense. They had to, because it was obviously implied that Silco was going to take Powder. I always want to call her Blossom for some reason, and I couldn't tell you why. um, but Silco was obviously, it was implied that he was going to take Powder and he was going to like do some brainwashing, indoctrination. So time needed to pass for that to happen, for it to
Yeah.
be viable that she is on the other side, if you like. But yeah, because I think when the time jump first kind of happens, Jinx is the first person that we see. Is that right?
I believe so. Yeah, the first person that we're aware of, either
Yeah.
her or what's the main politician guy called?
Jace.
Yes, Jace.
Young guy.
Yeah, it might be him. It's either him or Jinx. I'm pretty sure the first people we see in the 4th episode.
But that's funny because, like, it wasn't till ages later I remembered that because they call back to it, the bit when Jace is like in his, because it's his like workshop that they steal from initially.
Yeah.
And I completely forgot all about that until like almost the very end, when they call back when Victor's kind of standing on the ledge, and then he says, "Oh, am I interrupting something or whatever it is, which is what Victor had said to him when he was in his office bit. But yeah, I can't even remember how I started on this point. Oh, the time jump. Yeah, it was a weird one because obviously Jinx has aged so much, but everyone else kind of looked the same, so it was quite difficult to tell whether you were still in the kind of back in time, if you like, or whether you were still forward on that. Yeah. I think that was one of the things I read when I was kind of reading up on it, was some people's critiques was that it could be quite confusing at times, because I don't know whether that's because you haven't played the game and you're not as familiar with the characters or something.
Yeah, I thought it did a good. I mean, I quite liked the fact that I thought it did a good job of, like, I kind of mentioned it as a critique of Squid Game, where I feel like Squid Game sort of held your hand a bit too much at points and like sort of hammered some points home a bit too heavily. Whereas I feel like with Arcane, it was very much like expecting you to keep up at all times.
That's true. That was very refreshing, because I think a lot of shows now, and especially because that's a brand new show, and a lot of shows now, like you're saying about Squid Game, they are so like, oh, we'll come and show you absolutely everything and spell it out with exposition.
Yeah,
whereas
exactly.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It was a bit more like you had to be paying attention.
Yeah. The reason I was asking about the time jump was just because, like, I'm annoyed that Netflix has, like, done this. I don't really know why it's a thing, but, like, the icon, the thumbnail, I guess, for, like, Arcane, for me anyway, is like Powder / Jinx, but it's like a screen like shot basically from like the end of the last episode, where she's like sitting on the the sort of like the Jinx throne, and just right from the get-go. Yeah, right from the get-go, seeing that image, I remember thinking, like, without knowing anything about the show, I was like, I feel like that image looks quite like conclusive. Like,
that's a spoiler.
Yeah, it looks like something that's going to happen quite far down the line. It doesn't look like how the show begins, and then obviously when it opens and they're kids, I was like, well, at some point there's obviously going to be a jump forward, and I was like, I don't know, and I was like, I also feel like at some point Jinx is going to be the person that inherits the sort of power. And that pretty much is like how the series ends, with like her obviously like launching that rocket at the sort of like top side politicians and having killed Silco, and it's just like, I don't understand why like they would use that as like the main like image for the show. I
don't know why they do that. That's happened to me so many times, like where it's a blatant spoiler that's been in the thumbnail. Like, why have you done that?
Exactly. It's really, really annoying. I used to be like really careful with if I'd buy like a DVD and I hadn't seen the movie, because I remember realizing at one point, like, there was like a film that I hadn't watched, and I put on the DVD, and when it got to the menu was just like littered with spoilers for the film. Oh
yeah, and it just like plays basically like the film in the background.
Exactly, and it was sometimes like the entire like design of the menu is like predicated on something that will happen like towards the end, or like it's weird how much like they just assume a lot of the time like these things that you have just like already seen, and I get like generally you will have seen something before if you're buying like a DVD of it, but like not always, you know. I feel like especially beforehand, like when Blockbuster was more of a thing or was a thing, like before like sort of streaming, I feel like it was more of a thing that you would buy DVDs and not have like seen something, or rent DVDs and not have seen something. So it's weird.
Yeah.
It's weird that they just like throw spoilers out like that. But yeah, that was sort of one gripe I had with Netflix rather than the show.
So if you're listening, Netflix.
Exactly. Sort yourself out. So sort of moving on a bit. The animation. What did you think of the animation style?
I thought it was like I said, I'm not massive on like steampunk kind of thing, but I did really like the animation. I liked I think there was certain scenes that I really, really liked, and it was like the kind of fight scenes where it was just little snippets of slow-mo, which again kind of pulled it back into the fact that it was a game, and those are the points where it felt most like a game, but not in a bad way, because one of my issues with games is I really don't like the story bits. Like, I just want to play the game. I don't want to sit and listen to 10 minutes of these characters chatting. So I did have the fear going in that it was going to be a bit like that, but I feel like the fight scenes in that were just like fun. They were fun to watch. It did, like I said, it was like the best parts of playing a game. Um, One gripe I did have was kind of character design, because there were certain characters, mainly Jinx, who just was that overly like it felt very dated. I mean, I think I read the game came out in 2009, so that would have been the kind of style then. But it just felt super super dated. Like she was strutting about in these tiny like low rise shorts or whatever they were.
Yeah.
And like a tiny little like boob tube type thing. It just felt really like I feel like it cheapened it a little bit for me anyway. It just felt a bit trashy. But on the other hand,
Yeah.
they also did the same thing with Jace, where he was also overly sexualized, and he was so I suppose if you're gonna do it for one, you need to do it for all. Um, what did you think on animation overall?
I absolutely loved it. Like again, it kind of took me a bit of time to kind of like acclimatize to it. But then like the more I watched it, the more I was like, that was actually like my favorite part of it. Was I was just like, this looks jaw dropping at points.
Yeah.
I thought it was a really
There was the bit when they go into where is it Echo, the character's name, and it's like the tree, and it just looked amazing. I think the kind of scenery that always looked amazing, even when it was like the Undercity thing. They did that so well.
Yeah, I thought one thing that was really interesting, and I noticed it like, I like, yeah, noticed it towards the end, in particular, was like they did a really good job of putting like animated elements in like the background, so that it's not just like, I mean, it looks like when it's like sort of a still, it just sort of looks like an oil painting, but then you have like these like 3D sort of animated characters walking through it, but at the same time there's like then like moments of like 2D animation, but they do a really good job of like, I think it's like Silco and Jace when they meet, and you kind of have like the sort of sun set like across the ocean in the background, and they have like just like the light sort of shimmering on the water, and it just makes it feel like the world is constantly alive. There's like seagulls and stuff flying around, and it's just like, it's little touches like that I think go a really long way to making it actually feel like it doesn't feel like normal like animation where it can just like, sometimes you're watching animation and it's just like characters standing in front of like a still image and it just looks like that. But I thought they did a really good job of having it actually feel like they were like in a world, and like you say, like the fight scenes, the action and stuff was incredible, and like that fight scene with like Echo with the hoverboards and stuff, and where it just like suddenly becomes like suddenly just like introduce a different animation style, just for that like one fight scene basically. Yeah, I thought it was absolutely incredible. I thought I was really really impressed overall with like how good the show looked, and I'm curious because apparently they spent about 6 years developing the show. I'm curious like how much of that was just trying to actually decide on an animation style, because I know with like films like Into the Spider-Verse, the Spider-Man movie, they spent absolutely ages. I think Mitchell's and the Machines is another one where they spent absolutely ages like just trying to like figure out how the sort of exact style they wanted to animate, because it hadn't really been done like the specific way they wanted to, and I feel like they probably had to like spend some time figuring out the exact way they were going to do League of Legends as a show.
I think that's such a good point. I think what was also really good about it is that none of the characters look the same. Like they all, like when you watch things like The Simpsons, for example, like we were talking about last week, everyone looks the same. They've all got exactly the same. Just about, there's like a variation of like 5 face shapes, and they've all got the same eyes, the same nose. Whereas I feel like that did a really good job of, again, that kind of ties it in with the kind of world building idea where everyone looked the same and the people looked like they were from different places. Even though, like I said, like Jinx was not my favourite character design, I think some of the other ones were like perfect. Like Silco, he was so I think he looks great. He's so creepy, and he's got that kind of like spindly vibe where he just like uses like bad guy vibes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. And even there's even one point when like I remember he was like sitting on his like wee chair and talking, and I think he's just like breathing, and even just the way they animated him like breathing, I thought was just like really interesting, because it looked, the way that like his clothes and stuff and his sort of like stomach were like moving. I just thought was like, again, it was just like a detail. It just felt like it felt like there was like a really strong like attention to detail and stuff like that. Again, you don't really get that in a lot of animation, I don't think. Like characters breathing, like, you know, again, like you mentioned The Simpsons, you don't really see The Simpsons breathing at all. So I guess to like tie in a little bit to last week's episodes, because I am curious, would you class Arcane as adult animation?
Yes. Oh, that's a good one. I'd probably instinctively I would say yes. But when I'm thinking about it, there's like violence, but there's not maybe excessive violence the way that there is in some shows. I think that's such a good question, because there's weird bits where there's a lot of death, there's a lot of violence, and there's like implied drug use and things like that. But at the same time, maybe it's because of the source material, because it's a game, and lots of kids play games. That I didn't quite feel. What would you say? That's a hard one.
I don't know, and again, I kind of flip back and forth, because like for a lot of it I would say no, because like you say, it's based on a game and it's quite accessible in a lot of ways, but at the same time there are absolutely like mature themes, like you say. There's moments of violence, there is like bloodshed, there's also a sex scene, there's nudity like towards the end, and I think there's a little bit of swearing as well, so I'd say probably like just sort of like just makes it into like adult animation, because I would say like it's also mature, I guess. It feels like sort of mature storytelling and a mature sort of television show, despite the fact,
because even sorry, if you think about like Powder/Jinx, their whole like that girl is troubled. Like it's not the kind of thing that you would normally maybe see like a normal cartoon character going through.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. There's a sort of like complexity and depth to all the characters and the sort of arcs they go on, and I guess the relationships and stuff as well. So I guess a kid wouldn't really. I mean, they could watch it, but I don't think they would really get that much from it.
I don't think they would appreciate it in the way that it's maybe meant to and deserves to be appreciated.
Exactly. Probably too much dialogue.
Yeah.
For like most kids to kind of like care about it, even though there are some like really cool character like designs and stuff, and again the world I thought was really interesting. With regards to like other sort of production elements, did you have any sort of like overall thoughts or?
I think the one thing that really one of the things that really stood out was the music, and the Undercity, which was obviously the music of Imagine Dragons, which I thought was such a weird choice, but also very like apt. Like I felt like it fitted the kind of Undercity. I think that kind of music also served to kind of highlight or exaggerate the kind of the differences and the divide between like the Undercity and the kind of main city. Because you couldn't really imagine that kind of music being played up there during their council meetings.
Yeah, very true.
It was, I think though, other than the pieces of music that were very obviously Imagine Dragons, I don't remember music being particularly like having a particular kind of effect, or I don't really see it, like I don't really remember.
Yeah, I would agree.
Any of the music.
I couldn't like. I mean, there obviously was music in it, but like you say, like beyond Imagine Dragons, I don't. It felt almost sort of ambient. It didn't feel like there were sort of strong character themes. That like it didn't feel like there was that much of like a musical identity. Like you say, beyond like the sort of obvious stuff. Which is interesting again for something that's animated that relies a lot on like visuals. It's interesting that like it didn't feel like it had more of a musical voice. Imagine Dragons things was like I liked it, like I liked their inclusion, and like you say, it definitely fit like the Undercity thing. I was curious, does that count as like a cameo from them? Because like they just play an Imagine Dragons song and then they animate like a band singing it.
Yeah, I did not like that bit, I'm not gonna lie. No. I found it really But yeah, is that a cameo? I read somewhere that they like animated a proper like Arcane type music video for one of their songs.
Really?
Yeah.
That's fantastic. I wonder if they're. I wonder if Imagine Dragons are fans of League of Legends. Wonder if they ever dabble.
Yeah, that's a good question. Like if they're just sitting in their house playing away.
Yeah, exactly. Imagine going online and playing League of Legends and you're up against Imagine Dragons.
That would be very odd.
It would be very
But other than that, I think because you mentioned kind of in the notes like about sound and sound
Yep.
design, I feel like when you mentioned that, I thought back and the sounds in it were very like ASMR type.
Yeah.
They just sounded so like the mechanical noises just sounded really like, I don't know, soothing's a weird word, but do you know what I mean? I think they got it spot on, especially with characters like Jinx, who's always like tinkering with things, and Jace obviously, so it's, and even like the different sounds of when people are like injecting the shimmer. Is it shimmer? Yeah.
Yeah.
There was like sounds associated with that, so I think maybe that's kind of like what you were talking about when they didn't have music. I think maybe, do you think they've maybe just relied more on sound?
I think so, yeah. Because like the sound design really stood out to me, just as like, and I think it's part of it's probably because like I'm currently like in post production a couple of short films, and one of them has had like some issues with like sound design and stuff, where we just like been struggling to get like the right sort of sounds on certain moments, and it just like as a result it's just in my brain a lot, and it really sort of struck me with like obviously the show, which is animated, because like, you know, there is no actual depth to it, there is no actual like texture to this world, like it doesn't exist, it is just pixels on a screen. But the sound design does such like so much work in terms of making you believe that everything has sort of like a weight and feel, everything sort of like interacts in like a believable way, and like you say, like the way that characters walk and the sort of sound and the way that they like when they touch things, the sort of sound it makes, and it just again it felt to me like, yeah, it was just like really really masterfully done, where you constantly, everything felt real, which is kind of silly to say for something that is like a stylized and sort of high concept sort of world, but it did feel like, you know, if someone picks up a gun, it feels like, you know, that it has weight. It feels like it sounded right, and even just in terms of like even like framing and stuff as well, like the way that something would sound on a close up versus how something would sound from far away. I was really like sort of blown away by like how well they kind of, and again it must have been like so much work, but it did contribute a lot to making it feel like this was like a real world with real people in it, rather than it just being like, oh, it's just an animated thing that I'm watching.
I think definitely one of its like probably its main strength is that you can tell that they've made a conscious decision to make it an animated thing, as opposed to just animation would be easier or live action would be easier. Do you know what I mean? They've, like you're saying, they've done so much work on the character design, the design of like locations and things, and then the sound design. So yeah, it definitely feels like, you know how when you're watching some animated shows, even if they're good shows that you enjoy, like you're kind of watching it like, why is this animated?
Yeah.
like we were talking last time, I don't generally enjoy those shows because if there's no need for them to be animated, why are they animated? Do you know what I mean? If it's not bringing anything to it for
Absolutely.
it to be animated, then what's the point? I feel like this Arcane would not work, or it definitely wouldn't work as well. You'd run the risk of it being very CGI heavy had it been live action.
Yeah, I completely agree. Actually, I think it would take a lot of money and a lot of like top tier sort of production design to make it feel anywhere near as interesting and authentic. If it was like a live action show, like you say, there would have to be so much in the way of like special effects, and even then I don't know how well it would work, because like you have characters like what was he called, the councillor,
Hermandinger.
Hermandinger, that's it.
Of course, I never even thought about him. How would you create him?
Exactly, and you obviously have him like some sort of Yoda-esque like puppet or CGI creation, but I just don't think, I think he would stand out a lot more, whereas like he completely just fit with like the world that they build of the show.
Especially if I feel like his animation was always like when they had little close-ups of him, he just looked amazing. I like, because obviously he was like weird and funny almost, but he just looked like beautiful. Like the animation on him was beautiful.
Yeah, and I think with him you really get like the animation style that they chose, the sort of art style they chose really pays off, because like it did look like, again, like you said, he was furry and you could sort of tell that, but also it looked like he'd been like hand painted basically.
Yeah.
And I think it did just contribute to this like absolute like, yeah, he didn't just look like, you didn't look at him and just see loads of hair. You just sort of saw this like beautifully like designed character.
Yeah, I feel like he's a good example. He wouldn't even have worked had it been a different animation style. Had it been like a kind of computer animated where it was like overly fluffy, like you were saying there, that would just look, I can imagine that would just look horrible and take away kind of from what, because he's quite a serious character, do you know what I mean? I feel like if he was really fluffy it would be like, haha, look at that cute little character, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it would definitely undermine like a lot of what they do with him. And I was impressed as well. Like I liked sort of where they took that character and what they sort of did with him. One thing I'd say as well is he also serves, because I was going to ask about like what you thought of like sort of performances, because I think that like with him in particular you get a lot of like so much emotion in terms of just like what they do with the animation, not to detract from like the actor who like voiced him, because there is obviously like a lot of performance brought with just like the voice, but again the animation also does like a lot of work, and it is funny how like much they make you kind of like believe that this is like a real person, a real character that's like acting and reacting to things, and like has genuine emotions, despite the fact that it is really just like someone in a sound booth and then people on a computer.
Yep. That's such a good point.
So yeah, did you have any sort of like thoughts on like any of the performances? Were there any ones that stood out as like good, or any that stood out as bad? I'm kind of curious.
So I think my favourite character was Silco, and I feel like his performance was it was that lovely way. We've spoken about it briefly before with Devil Wears Prada, where when Meryl Streep's playing the villain, she speaks in this like soft spoken voice, and it just makes people want to listen to her. And Silco has the same kind of thing where he doesn't generally shout, or he's not overtly aggressive or anything like that, but just he's got like the way that he speaks is really like chilling. And I think it would have been really easy for him to become a caricature, because he's very like, there is scope for that to happen. He's like this kind of lord of the underworld character that we've seen plenty of times before. But yeah, I do think Silco definitely stood out to me. Another one that I thought I just wanted to mention was the character of Caitlin, who's the enforcer from like the kind of privileged background.
Yeah.
Do you know who she is? Do you know who she's played by?
No.
She's played by a girl, I can't remember what her name is, but it's the girl that played Cho Chang in Harry Potter.
Really?
Yeah. I
Wow,
would never have
Katie Leon?
guessed. Yes, that's it. I would never ever have guessed, because in Harry Potter she's got that crazy Scottish accent.
Two pumpkin
Do you know that
pasties,
way?
please.
2 pumpkin pasties, please. Yeah, she's got that accent, and then when you watch Arcane, had I not googled it by accident, I would never have known that was her. And even after I googled it, I was like, is that right? Is that definitely her? So props to her for that. I feel like she did a pretty good job. She was believable. I feel like her accent was pretty good as well.
Absolutely.
I can't think of any that are standing out as being. Oh, do you know whose voice I did not like?
Who?
Vander. His voice just was. Why did he have that weird English accent?
The
like
proper Cockney geezer.
Yes, I just every time he opened his mouth, I thought, oh god, that's not the voice I would have chosen for him. It just yeah.
I actually would completely agree. I didn't dislike Vander, but I did definitely think like his accent stood out to me. Like every single time he spoke, I was aware of it.
Yep.
And it did 100%. Feel.
It was so jarring every time he spoke. I was like, oh god, I forgot about that.
Yeah, and I think as well it made him feel more like a cliched character than I think he was, because it just felt like, oh, of course that's the voice they've given him. And I think probably also contributed a little bit to like the not lack of interest, but like lack of like real love for the show to begin with like he's
yeah.
obviously like a main character for the first like 3 episodes, and then they do the sort of inevitable thing, which is obviously they kill him off, which I thought was interesting as well. And I thought it was kind of funny because like episode 3 is pretty much all about like killing him off, but it's funny because like the episode begins and I thought they were like killing him at the start, and then they don't. And then, like,
Yeah.
the whole episode is just like, when are they offing this guy? Because it's happening at some point in this episode. Like, it's got to now.
Yeah, there's a couple of like red herrings as well, like, oh, that's him dead, and then he comes back and you're like, oh, here he is again.
Yeah, I know, they really drag that one out, don't they?
Yeah. What about,
but-
was there any that you particularly enjoyed?
I think Silco's definitely a good pick as well. I think they did a really good job of making him feel both like powerful and powerless in some ways. Like he, like you say, is a sort of like, I guess like he lurks in the shadows and sort of like pulls a bunch of strings, but he's not. And it does feel like he's intelligent and sort of like cold and calculated, but it didn't feel like overwhelmingly so. Like it did feel like there was a vulnerability to him, and I think they do show like, you know, he has these plans and stuff, and he has like a sort of mechanical like map or in his head of like how he wants things to pan out and what he's doing. But yeah, I think it's interesting, and I think as well like they show that he is like sort of cold and ruthless, but there is also like a little bit more mercy to him than I think I expected. You know, like there's multiple scenes where like people sort of question him, and people do sort of die, but also not all of them. Which again, I just thought it was interesting that they do that rather than just like doing the cliched thing of like anyone that speaks out against them is like immediately killed on the spot. And there are points where he sort of loses. I also liked like his relationship with Jinx. I thought was actually like really well handled, because I didn't. Again, it felt like it was. It is sort of like trope, a sort of cliched thing that you know, him sort of like becoming her like surrogate father and like you say, like indoctrinating her. And I was impressed at how like the way that they sort of added depth to it, because it didn't feel like they do make a big point of like, you know, sort of expressing their dynamic, but I didn't feel like it was like overdone. It felt like it was like quite nuanced in a lot of ways, and I really appreciated the sort of payoff where he's sort of killed, and you know, his sort of last act is really like speaking out in love of Jinx, and I just I thought it was an interesting thing to do, especially because obviously they have the setup of him being like Vander's brother, and having like almost been killed by Vander, and like sort of surviving that. I thought it was interesting that they give him like an emotional arc.
I think one of the strengths was definitely like the character development for like a lot of the characters. They felt like almost like real people, which is funny because it's not even just like an animated show, it's an animated show based on a game.
Yeah.
But they felt like Jace, for example, he like changed with his role in the way that you would, and when you watch so many TV shows and that, there's a character who has this one character trait, like they're moral and that's it, they're moral through and through, whereas characters like Jace, he had moments where he was really struggling with things, where he couldn't decide whether he would abide by the council or whether he would go kind of with his gut and what was good for people, for all of the people. And then he had that moment where he got really caught up in that fight and he killed what turned out to be a wee boy.
Yeah.
So that's just one example. Obviously, there was Victor as well. He was a good example where I just think that's definitely one of his strengths. It made it a lot more interesting that you could guess almost how people were going to act, but then I don't know, it just made it feel a lot more real. Like, people are flawed and people do make decisions for the wrong reasons and things like that, so it was interesting to see that, and especially in an animated show, I felt.
Yeah, and I think as well, like you say, like there's arcs, there's like development with all the characters, but I think it's interesting the way that they do it, and like they do make mistakes. Like they have, like you say, like Jace, like he's obviously like a scientist, and then they you know, he becomes like a politician basically, and they do sort of show that he is like inexperienced, he is like a bit out of his depth, and he is sort of being manipulated, but they manage to, which again is like a very like sort of cliched storyline, and like character sort of like set up, but I think they did a good job of, like, again, like you say, making him feel real and believable, and like he does make mistakes, but he does learn from them in an interesting way, which I thought was quite good. And it does, like, for instance, they mentioned like, oh, you're not been to war, you don't know what war's like, but he is also like being pushed to take like stronger action by like certain characters, and then it's interesting, just like he, like you say, he does, and then he kills that kid, and he has that reaction, and again, it felt like a nice sort of, like, it wasn't overdone, that that moment. It felt like it very much could have been like played out a lot more than it was. But yeah, and I really liked like his sort of like love interest as well, the way that she's developed, and sort of the way that they introduce like her backstory, and obviously her mother sort of comes into it as well. And I thought it was a really interesting way to sort of flesh out the dynamics there, and even the fact that Jace has like a different relationship with her mother than she does, and she has a different relationship with her mother, and it's not any one thing. It's not like the mother arrives and she's just like an extension of that character. It felt like the mother was like her own character with her own sort of like history and beliefs and sort of opinions, and it's things like that I thought worked like exceptionally well. And even like, I guess, like we're talking about Hermdinger and whatever he's called, and the fact that he is obviously like centuries old, and they do mention that there is a bit of a disconnect between, like, he is obviously like patience is like his, or one of his core sort of values and sort of principles that he abides by, but it's because he has lived for a very long time, and he has this perspective that no one else does, but at the same time it's like that, as much as he is like probably the wisest character, as like Victor for instance mentions, I think it's Victor that says, like, he doesn't, like, the rest of them don't all have the lifespan that he has. They can't always afford to be as like patient as he is, because like at the end of the day, like, they are on like a finite they're here for a finite amount of time. So sort of moving on a little bit, I guess, I wanted to talk about the openings of the episodes. Did you have any particular thoughts on like the episode openings?
So again, this was another one, which is funny because I only just finished watching it a few days ago. When you initially mentioned it, nothing massively was standing out, except I do remember the first episode, the very opening bit when they were walking over the bridge, and it was Vi and Powder and Vander. That was about the only one that I can remember off the top of my head. I think potentially it could just be because the way that I watched them, because I watched them like one after the other, so they kind of like, it's difficult now to kind of differentiate where they ended and where they began, because I feel like it was almost like a kind of like almost old-fashioned way where they did it, where each episode kind of ended on a high, and then so of course if the next episode was starting on a high, it would just for me be part of the one kind of arc thing. So as I say, the only one that I could specifically remember in detail was the first episode, if I'm honest.
That's very fair. And it was something that stood out to me, but I did watch every episode pretty much in isolation. Like, I think I watched the last two episodes back to back, but other than that, I pretty much just watched every episode as like a standalone thing. And as a result, the beginnings sort of stood out to me a lot more. And I think just because like I thought they did a lot of interesting things with the openings. Like for instance, the second episode opens with sort of Jace's backstory, where you find out he's young and he's saved by that sort of like magician, and then episode 3 is like, it opens on it's sort of Silco's backstory, and I think episode 5 is like the one that focuses on Echo, and I was impressed at I think 6, and then 6 I think might be when it's that I can't remember her name, it's Jace's love interest. I'm pretty sure that's when you get like her backstory. So I think I thought they did a really good job of like using the opening of each episode to sort of subvert your expectations, but also do it in a way that like built out the world and the characters. I liked it. I thought it was an interesting way, because like obviously they do sort of end the episodes on cliffhangers, and it's an interesting way to just like, rather than going straight in and trying to deal with that, it allows you, because I think there's usually like a bit of like time between the end of one episode and the start of the next. I don't think any of them properly like roll straight onto the next one, with maybe the exception of like episodes 2 to 3, I think. But yeah, I think that like having that opening where it like fleshes out like a character's backstory allows you to then go back into the story after a little bit of like time has passed, and it doesn't feel jarring.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
I just personally, it was just something that I had picked up on. I liked what they did with it. I just thought it was like, it definitely felt like they had made it like their mission statement to like have a different and interesting opening for like each episode. And I thought
I did, yeah. It's a good way, like you were saying, it's a really good way to kind of flesh out the characters, and then by extension the worlds, because obviously the different characters inhabit different spaces and things like that. So it was like a nice kind of way, almost subtle way to see a bit more of like the Undercity, or do you know what I mean, or worlds out with the kind of main cities that we were used to. So obviously like Jace's love interest, whose name I also can't remember. We obviously saw about her kind of background and where she was from, which is not even somewhere that we revisited later on in the series. So yeah,
that's true. It's very true actually. And I'll be so I guess moving on again. We obviously have discussed kind of characters. We've kind of discussed this stuff already, but I'm curious if you just have any like sort of extraneous thoughts on like characters, the sort of lore and the world building that the show like sort of implements.
So I think I would start with saying one character that I notably didn't really like was Vi.
Oh really?
Yeah. I feel like she, out of all of them, was the most kind of like cliched. Like, she had her one personality trait, and that was taking care of Powder. And then that was all she wanted to do, which is fair. That's her little sister, fair enough. But everyone else kind of adapted and changed, and in some cases grew, in some cases like regressed. But she very much like her, she felt more cliched. She was the protector, and then the whole time during the time jump we don't see her because she's in jail, and she's getting really tough in jail, she's getting beaten up all the time, and then she comes out and she still wants to do exactly the same thing she did before she went into jail. I don't know, I think normally we've spoken before about like protagonists like the hero where they can be quite boring, and I think she was a very good example of that. Which I think is nice why they kind of paired her up with, or when they paired her up with Caitlin, that was a little bit of excitement. But yeah, Vi, not my fave, if I'm honest.
I would agree with pretty much what you said. I liked Violet as a character, but I would agree that she was very much like a safe sort of protagonist mold, and I guess you hadn't really thought about it tons until you were sort of saying there, but I guess like it is almost like a wasted opportunity with the time jump, because like she just like literally does not develop at all pretty much.
No.
and the time span that's jumped, she is just like in prison the whole time, so literally like you basically just pick up with that character exactly where we left off.
She doesn't seem to have any adverse effects either to the fact that her two best friends were killed in front of her, that her dad or father figure or whatever was also murdered in front of her, that her sister was taken from them and is now, do you know what I mean? She didn't seem to have any kind of adverse effects from that.
That's a very good point actually, and she's the one that like basically witnessed it, and at the time, like at the end of the third episode, her reaction to it is obviously very strong and kind of understandably so, but yeah, it's weird how like she has that reaction and then that's it. Like that's kind of like, that's that dealt with. She just kind of
file
like,
that away.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's it. I've had my emotion from that experience, and
exactly.
Now it's time for new. I do agree actually. I really like the pairing up with her and Caitlin. Thought that was a really interesting like dynamic and way to sort of like show the sort of contrast between worlds and pitting like two sort of like ideologies against each other. And I think as well as a romance, it really worked for me just in terms of like the subtlety of it. Again, it didn't feel like again, you know, with there being like a same-sex relationship, which is still like, it still is quite a groundbreaking thing, especially in like animation. As we know, we discussed in a podcast last year, like it's not something you are seeing tons of, and it felt like, again, I was worried when they were hinting at it earlier on. I was worried that they were going to make it like really in your face and really sort of like overplayed, but it wasn't. Like they just sort of let it happen. And there's not.
Yeah,
really...
it felt a lot more like organic that way.
Yeah, absolutely. It felt real. It didn't feel like they were like, oh my god, you're my soulmate and I love you so much. It wasn't like one of those like Hollywood sort of like romances that is like suddenly like the biggest thing in the world. It just felt like, okay, these are two characters that have a sort of intimacy and a connection. And it is like, yeah, it very much sort of just like exists between the two of them. And they mention it like once or twice, but it's not really like it's not really like discussed that much. So I really sort of dug that. I think one thing I really liked about it as well was it felt like it did a really good job of colouring like ancillary characters. Like, you know, it felt like obviously there were multiple overseer characters, and even they had like their own sort of like depth to them, and sort of backstories. You know, there's the one that obviously like it ends up being killed, and he is, you know, he has his family and stuff like that. And again, it just felt like when he's introduced, it just felt like, okay, he's someone with like a bit of an axe to grind, but they do give him more of like a character than that, which I was impressed by, and it feels like they do that quite a few times. Even like, you know, characters like Echo, who obviously like are ultimately pretty minor, but are sort of reoccurring at the same time, and every time they do sort of like crop up and the way that they're used, it is interesting. You know, I felt like I was constantly like engaged and intrigued. I don't think there was like, which is what you want, you know, every time you like characters are sort of like reappearing. I was always interested to see where they were sort of what they were doing with them.
Definitely.
What about the sort of world building aspects of it? Did you think it did an effective job? Do you think it was like, because again, it was one of those things that I feel like when you are sort of building out a world, sometimes it can feel very like expository. You know, there is like, obviously, because there's a lot to the world, and it sometimes can feel like really sort of like ham-fisted and in your face. It can sort of like, I guess, like stall the momentum of a plot and stuff like that. Did you think it suffered from that, or?
I don't think so. I think like we've kind of discussed, there was so many things that really helped with the kind of world building, and I don't think it was massively exposition heavy. I think there was times where there was just like, there was one point in particular when they were talking about the counsellors and how one of them spouted off like, oh, for as long as however many hundred of years there's only been 7 counsellors. I was like, did we need to know that? Like, do you know what I mean? It felt, but those moments were really, I felt, kind of few and far between. The dialogue between the characters felt a lot more kind of natural, like the way that you would talk to people. There wasn't like, I always love when you're watching shows and like it's, for example, they could have done it a lot with like Powder and Vi, where they do it a lot in TV shows where they're like, oh, you'll remember when our parents died 6 years ago. Like, no one speaks like that. Do you know what I mean? And I didn't feel that this show was guilty of it. As I say, I think they did really well in using, like you were talking about, they were quite subtle on the way that they were doing it. They were introducing different characters to introduce different things. Obviously the flashbacks from characters past and things like that were super interesting. I think a really interesting way to do it might have been to have your main man Hermandinger. If we'd seen more about him, that could have been a really cool way to see maybe like the start of the City of Progress or whatever it was. So if we'd seen it before that might have been interesting. But there probably would have been less of a divide between the Undercity and there. So yeah.
That's a very good point, actually, and it would be interesting to see if they do anything with that. And I think it would be. He's definitely like, there's scope there for like, because having that character allows you basically an entry point into the shows in the world sort of past, where you could like have that character and you could see through his eyes sort of what the world used to be like. And I think I'd definitely be interested in knowing, like you say, like what it was like beforehand, and how much things have sort of changed. I would agree. Like, I didn't think there was like maybe like there was always going to be like more exposition, like sort of front loaded, than in the rear, because like obviously you need to like make sure that people understand the world and the sort of ramifications of everything. And I think there was a little bit of that with like the whole Arcane thing, and there was a lot of like discussion of like, oh, magic is like bad, but it's also not bad, and but yeah, like it wasn't overdone. It wasn't like, and it didn't feel like. I think every scene in which there is exposition also exists for like its own right. Like it also has like, it will serve the characters and the story at the same time. It won't just like there won't just be like, oh, here's the exposition scene in which we will now just exposit, and then that's like that scene. And I think they do a good job of like, I guess like pacing the exposition as well, so it doesn't feel like, even though it is like sort of front loaded, it doesn't feel overwhelming. It doesn't feel like you're just getting hit with like barrages of information. It feels like it's sort of like nicely distributed, so that you're like learning about the world and the dynamics and like politics and stuff, but in a sort of authentic way. And I guess it makes you curious to find out more, rather than like just being told everything. Because that's the thing, is like if you just get told everything in one go, then you kind of like switch off a little bit. I think like you're just kind of like, I didn't really care about all of that.
100%.
Remember going to see Marvel's Eternals last November, which I'm just not a fan of, and that opens with like, I think like 3 paragraphs of like exposition, which is then like also delivered in the movie. Like this, all the stuff it tells you, again, makes you read at the beginning. Like the movie just like authentically tells you as well, but it just makes it feel like like so much of the opening of that movie is just like relentless exposition and not very much like interesting sort of like world building or character.
I love that. There's that joke in The Simpsons as well, where I think it's Homer says something. It's when they're at Itchy and Scratchy Land and the robots are malfunctioning, so they need to take their pictures to like hardwire their brain or whatever, so that the robots will break. And Homer points that out. He's like, "Oh, we need to take their pictures and then they'll break." And Bart makes a joke like, "Who are you, the narrator? Like, why did we need all that info? We can figure things out for ourselves."
It's a very good reference and a very good point. It didn't feel like the show was very guilty of that. It felt like everything was sort of believably delivered, and obviously the political characters do sort of exist for like a lot of exposition, for the sake of a lot of exposition, but it also felt like they did enough with that like story and those characters that it also like justified its existence in its own right.
Because there needs to be some exposition, because if there wasn't, like we were saying, it could be quite confusing at times. There's things that, like, it's a made-up world, so you're not going to know what things are unless they're explained to you. So
exactly.
I think it definitely got the balance.
Absolutely.
It got the balance. It did the balance well, if not perfect, but well.
I would agree. I completely agree. So finally, last thing I wanted to kind of ask about is season 2, because they have confirmed they are making a second series, which probably isn't that surprising if you haven't watched it all the way through. So would you watch a season 2, do you think? And do you have any sort of like thoughts on where it might go, or any sort of like desires for where they'd like to take it?
I think I would definitely watch a second season. I think especially for that ending. That was like the perfect way to end the season. It was just such like a good cliffhanger, but not in an infuriating way. You know how sometimes shows had cliffhangers that you were just like angry because they were clearly just a cliffhanger just to get you back to watch the other one. But that one made sense. It made sense for Jinx to. Jinx is such a interesting character as well. Like, she's one of the ones you never quite know what she's gonna do, and that's what makes her so good. And like we were saying before, they don't shy away from people doing bad things or people killing people. So the fact that she went out and just, like, in an act of sheer war, went out and fired like the big kind of basically fired their own weapon back at them. That's really interesting. I think it came at such a perfect time, because they'd all just voted to kind of make peace with Silco, and so I would definitely watch to see what the kind of aftermath of that would be. And I imagine from watching the first series, I wonder if they would take it the same kind of route as this, as the first episode, where you're just seeing the aftermath. I wonder if they would do it that way. That would probably be good. Because then they have scope, like we were saying, to go back before that and things like that. I think they should definitely focus. I mean, I think there was a good amount of Jinx in there because I feel like too much would be really grating. So I think I really like Jinx as a character. I think she's, like I was saying, like she's super interesting. But it'll be interesting to see how she behaves now that Silco's not there.
Absolutely, and yeah, I definitely like intrigued in where they take that character next, and I think obviously they positioned where they've left it with like her and Violet and stuff as well. There's definitely like a lot of scope for what they sort of do there, and hopefully like it can kind of serve to make Violet a bit more interesting. But yeah, I completely agree about the cliffhanger as well. Like I think I would definitely watch the season 2, and I think the cliffhanger worked. I absolutely loved the ending just for the fact that it felt like you said, a cliffhanger, but also like a payoff. Like it felt like the right place for the story to sort of like conclude. Where like it didn't feel unsatisfying, like you said, like it wasn't just like they tease you with something huge that you then have to like wait for season 2 to find out. It's just like, okay, you know, even if they never made a second series, it's like that could just stand on its own right as a show, and there is like a complete payoff to like pretty much like everything major like this set up. And I think I'd definitely be interested. I'd be curious if it sticks with having the same protagonists, or if it adjusts. I feel like it will obviously keep Violet as a protagonist, especially with like the ending being so like Jinx heavy. It would be weird for it to just like completely like push her to the sides, but I would be interested to see if they're how they sort of develop other characters, and if they shine like spotlights again, like I said, like Hermdinger and stuff, and if they shine spotlights on like characters like him who didn't get as much development in series 1 and as much attention. So I'm definitely intrigued with where they get it. I will say I don't believe for a second that all the characters in that room, even though they obviously just had like a missile launched at them, I don't think for a second they're all dead.
Jace has gotten out of that somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. He's 100% still going to be in season 2. I think most of them are. All the ones that will be killed off will be the ones that had like 0 screen time. That one with like
the people who that weren't even named. Those people, they'll be cut off like the deadwood.
Yeah, exactly. So it's definitely an interesting place for it to launch a second series as well, because it is this huge
sort of no pun intended.
Yeah, exactly. Because it is this big cataclysmic event, and the ramifications of it will be huge. And like again with like Silco being dead and stuff as well, there's now like obviously technically a power vacuum, although you imagine Jinx will sort of like fill it. So yeah, I think there's where they've left it is pretty much perfectly positioned for a second series, and I'll be right there with you watching it. So I look forward to it when it eventually comes.
Do you know when it's coming out, or have they got a release date or anything for it yet?
I don't think they've confirmed a release date. I literally just had like the quickest search on this before like the podcast started, just because I was curious. Mostly because I was seeing, I'm pretty sure that they had confirmed a second series, but I wanted to check. But no, I think they said it's not coming this year, because again it mentioned the fact that it took them 6 years to make the first series, but they said it's not going to take them that long to make season 2. So I'd assume probably next year, although it might be in like the back half of next year. And that kind of also, I guess that kind of aligns with like Netflix's release and development sort of like cycle, because like Stranger Things, for instance, that takes like years between like seasons, and I feel like I can see them doing the same with like Arcane. Obviously I think Squid Game, obviously mentioned before, is going to be like a wee while before, which I'm happy with. Like I'd always rather a show take a bit longer, but then actually like deliver.
Took his time and did it properly,
Yeah, and I think in many ways we're in like a bit of a golden era with television, in the sense that like we're past that time when TV shows had to run for like 20 odd episodes and like 9 seasons in order to like justify their existence. And I'm glad that we're living in a time where like you have like stories that, because even like Squid Game and Arcane both had like 9 episodes, but it felt like that's because that's how many they needed to tell the story. It didn't feel like, oh, we have to like hit this like episode quota.
I feel like I don't, obviously just because the way that TV creation and watching has changed, when you watch a show that has like a mid-season break, it feels quite outdated now.
Yeah, Absolutely.
Especially if you're like binge watching it and you can feel when it's a mid-season break episode.
Yeah, you totally can. I think it's interesting as well. I mean, this is really just like a whole other podcast. But yeah, there is like, I noticed it when I was watching Buffy. You even have things like, because obviously it's structured around there being like ad breaks. So there'll be like constant cliffhangers and then like cut to black and then like the episode will sort of like fade in on the next scene. And a lot of the time it will be like, there'll be like a moment where something happens and it cuts to black and then it like fades back
and then
in.
it'll happen
and it's
immediately
like
again.
Yeah, exactly. And I just find it interesting that like that is you can feel the formatting of the show. And now when you binge things, you do kind of like, it just stands out as like really weird. So
I feel like shows
binging
now are created for binge watching, whereas obviously before you didn't have the means to binge watch it. So
exactly, and I think it's helped. I think like the fact that they know that people binge watch things and that they can rewatch things as well, I think is like, again, it leads to things like Arcane, where it feels like they will set something up and then pay it off like episodes later, but they will pretty much just expect you to remember the thing that they've set up, the detail that they've sort of given you, rather than like, again, doing like Squid Game, which was, Squid Game was obviously guilty of like, it would set something up and then pay it off, but it would like, I think the first episode had it a few times where it would like then show you a flashback of the moment where something was set
you could
up.
almost see the characters like winking at the camera like
exactly.
Remember?
Yeah. Exactly. Whereas I like that like shows are now like Arcane or they're like, we're just going to trust that people who are watching this show are paying attention, and if they're not, then like it's up to them to
that's
get
on
like,
you.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. So just before we sort of conclude, do you have any other sort of like extra thoughts that you maybe haven't like had the chance to say, or do you feel you sufficiently sort of like outlined your stats on Arcane?
I feel like it was such an interesting show that we could have done like multiple podcasts on it and chat for hours. I feel like it's such an interesting show that it's one of those ones I would definitely want other people to watch, so that you could talk to other people and see what their thoughts were. So I'm still slowly trying to convince people to watch it. So far, no one's taken me up on it yet. But I'll let you know when they do.
Please do. Just rope them into doing a podcast. Then they'll have no choice.
Exactly. I'm like, I've got a good idea.
Excellent.
But no, it was such like, I'm glad that you chose it, because it's, as I said, it's definitely not something that I would have chosen on my own. And had I not been watching it for the podcast, I might not have even made it past the first episode. Which is a shame.
Yep. And I completely agree. Like, I also, I mean, it's came out last year, and I heard nothing but praise, but I thought it would be interesting. Knowing literally nothing about it, I thought it'd be an interesting one, just because I'd only heard good things, just to see if it like lived up to the hype. And I thought it would be nice. I think it's interesting going into something blind. Like, it's nice when you don't have any sort of context or something, I think. And I'm very glad that you actually enjoyed it, because I would have felt really guilty if 9 episodes later you were like, that was awful. What have you done?
Yep. It was so funny, because after I watched season 3, I wanted to message you and be like, oh, this is good, but then I had to honestly restrain myself the entire time.
Yeah, I know, and I kept like, every time you mentioned watching episodes, I was very tempted to always ask like, what you thinking of it. I was like, nope, I'm just gonna wait. I want to find out on the podcast what you thought of it.
But no, very good choice. Thank you very much, Sam.
Thank you. Well, thank you for watching it, and as always for the discussion. If anyone watching has seen Arcane, feel free to like let us know your opinion. Anything that we might have like said you disagree with or agree with, or any thoughts that you have that maybe we didn't touch on. And yeah, as ever, thank you very much for watching, and we will see you next time.
See ya.
Farewell.